So, hello, my name is Dam Kinehild, the library. On the handout, if you are looking at it, you will note that it says Kinehild Kunasigasdóttir. That was my former SCA name until I discovered that heralds could not pronounce it on the fly. So, yes, hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. Indeed, yes. So I am Dam Kinehild. I have Pelican for being a busybody, and Laurel in research and old dead languages with a specialty sort of focusing on the Germanic languages and sort of broader early medieval Northern European culture. So what is, I guess let's do some real quick business keeping. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and I will do my best to keep an eye on that. I will actually open that up right now so that I don't lose it. And I'll read your question aloud and then try and answer it if I can. Feel free to just interrupt me if you've got one. If you can't get the chat to work, just pop in and interrupt. I will not be offended. I'm here to help you. So any way that I can make your learning better is good for me. At the end, we'll open it up for sort of general discussion and questions, at which point feel free to ask me not anything, but nearly. So the goal of this class is to introduce you, the students, to some skills for producing well-researched, well-documented entries. The goal is kind of let's demystify research, make it less scary, and make it something that's fun because research is the battle cry, and it's also like the best. So real quick caveat, there is no rule in the SCA about how period or not what you do is. If you make it super period, cool. If you're not into that, also cool. But what I would personally ask is that if you are going to do something and you're going to present it in an arts and science competition, or even just like an outfit that you're wearing, right? Don't tell somebody that it's a researched period piece if you have not done the research and it is not, right? So don't represent something as it's not. Conversely, you know, if you've done the research and it is a super period piece, feel free to be like, yo, I did the research. This is really cool. You want to talk about it? And because 9 times out of, if you can't find anybody to be excited about your research, you've got my email at the top of the page. Feel free. I am always here to be enthusiastic about what you've learned. And I love learning new things. So I think some of you at least have been subjected to my trivia nights. I am constantly collecting trivia information. Jessamond, I just saw your comment. This is being recorded and I'll post it to my YouTube page. Probably it'll go up tonight and then I'll post it tomorrow. And I will share that link in the Facebook event. So research. What are some, so the big thing with research is research means starting with sources and reading those sources, ingesting those sources, and taking that information and coming up with some kind of item or like some output, right? So either you do research and you create a piece of art, or you do research and you get together with your friends on Saturdays and talk about sagas on the internet, or you do research and you write a paper. However it works out, this is gathering information, digesting it, producing something. So let's start with how you gather that information. You're going to look at sources. What are different types of sources? We have a primary source, which is an original document or artifact. This is the primary. This is the most connected to the moment in time that you are looking at. Then you have a secondary source, which is somebody writing about that item, right? So a great example of this, you're going to watch me reach off screen. So this, whether or not you would count this as a primary source is a little tricky, but this is a facsimile of a 16th century manuscript. So it is an exact copy of how the manuscript appears, including bleed through and all that kind of good stuff. And you can see it's all in the original language and all that kind of good stuff. So this is generally what I would consider a primary source. Certainly it's the most primary thing that I can get and own in my home, right? Without having to go to a museum or an academic library to view original documents. Secondary sources would be something like this book. So this book is a series of articles about that document. So primary source is the document itself, secondary source, articles about the document. Tertiary source is when you start to take further steps back. So now you are viewing it through the lens of these secondary sources. You might reference back to the primary source, but it's generally a much broader discussion. So you could have like encyclopedia entries would be a good example of a tertiary source. The examples in my handout here would be primary source is a letter from King Henry II to Pope Alexander III. Secondary source would be an article specifically focused on that letter. Tertiary source would be a book about the death of Thomas à Becket and sort of the controversy and all that kind of stuff, like all of it wrapped up into a broader picture. So when you're doing research, you really, if possible, relying on sources as close to the primary source as possible is really, that's the best, right? And it's difficult though, because often these primary sources, especially as medievalists, these primary sources are not going to be in modern English or another modern language. So if you don't necessarily speak them, you're going to speak the historical languages, you're going to have to work through a translation. When you are talking about your research, it's always good to note that you were using somebody else's translation. So a great example is like a book like this. So this is Old Norse women's poetry. It provides primary examples of the poetry. So it's an edited version, but it's in Old Norse. And then they have a translation into English, and then they have a prose translation because Norse poetry is confusing, I think is the nicest way to put that. So it's good to have an explanation of what is being meant there. So this is a good example of sort of a primary source that's accessible to a modern reader. And there is a debate to be had again about whether or not this would really count as primary, or if this is really a secondary source because you're accessing it through somebody else's translation as well as somebody else's editing. But for our purposes, basically primary. So I think we've covered primary sources, secondary sources. This can also include articles. So here's a great example, some articles, journal articles on luck, in this case, the Norse concept of luck, that I'm doing some reading for another project, biographical works, commentaries, criticisms, histories, that kind of stuff. Tertiary, that's going to be, like I mentioned, again, stepping back and distilling more information from primary and secondary sources, almanacs, chronologies, dictionaries, encyclopedias, this kind of good stuff. So where do we find these sources? Let me sing you the song of the library. So you may have noted that my SCA surname is La Library. That is not on accident. That is because I think libraries are the greatest thing ever. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a question, Ghislaine. May a secondary and tertiary sources occur contemporary more or less to the primary? So Ghislaine, that's a really good question. I think you see less of that, though certainly not none of it in medieval history. With modern works, you see more of it because you've got a more, frankly, you've got a more active publishing area. So it's easier to have somebody write a book, and then you've got some literary critic come in and they talk about that book, and then somebody else comes in, right? So they can be fairly contemporary. I think we just don't have a lot of that surviving from the Middle Ages. Whether or not there was I honestly don't know that there was that much of a sort of literary or artistic critic community in the Middle Ages. Something I don't know a lot about. Would my Henry VIII reference be an example of that? I'm really sorry, guys. Somebody just knocked on my door. I will be right back. talk amongst yourselves.
This is so cool. Ooh,
Well, that was wild.
a present.
Holy crap. Somebody just brought me a book because they love me. And I don't know
And
who
you,
it was.
and you got it in your research class. How awesome
I
is
got it
that?
during my research class. The book is called From Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, 2nd edition, A Linguistic History of English. This is going to be my bedtime reading for the next like month or two. This is okay. Sorry. Hi. I like books, and I totally recorded that, so that's going in the YouTube video. Anyway, Henry VIII reference. So it's actually the Henry we're talking about in this case is Henry the Second. That wouldn't be something I think that would be an example of that, just because you're not going to have like those journal articles and books on the death of Thomas à Becket. So I guess, you know, there was, I don't know that I would really consider it contemporary, but there certainly was a lot of discussion about the death of Thomas à Becket, though I don't know that people would have been writing about necessarily a letter from the king to the Pope. So no, it's totally fine, Ciela. You know, Henry VIII is probably the most famous of the Henrys. So I will point out Henry II is actually my favorite Henry, just because he's such a bureaucrat. And as a bureaucrat, it speaks to me. But I hope that I've kind of answered your guys' questions. I think the answer generally is possible, but unlikely when we talk about medieval stuff. Completely derailed by that book. I'm very sorry. I'm going to take a drink of water. So libraries, that's where I was at. Libraries. If you have a local library, that is an excellent place to start. Now, yes, it does also depend on the field, math, current events, that kind of stuff. Hello, librarian. I am not actually a librarian. As I mentioned, I'm a bureaucrat, so I work for the state, but that's not the point. The point is I love libraries very, very much. So first step, find out if your library has an interlibrary loan program. I live in Anchorage, Alaska. We have an interlibrary loan program here. So it is not outside the realm of possibility that your local library has one too. Failing that, it may be part of a library consortium that has access to an ILL program through another institution. Failing that, the internet is a wild place. There are many people who have, I am not in this video going to tell you to go find and illegally download published works, but the internet is a wild place, and just, you know, practice safe interneting. So start with your libraries. If there's academic journals are a phenomenal resource. They can be a little stuffy and they can be a little hard to figure out at first, but there are a number of great websites that will help you search through them. EBSCOhost is a good example. Somebody's post, I had to explain our little library. Oh, sorry. If you've got institutional access, or ask, sorry, I'm like reading the comments and just responding to those. JSTOR is another really good example, and JSTOR for 2021, I believe for the full year, you can actually get access to JSTOR articles to read online, which is an outstanding resource because they hold a huge catalog. So, you know, check with your libraries. EBSCOhost is a good example. JSTOR is a good example. There's lots of resources. WorldCat is another good sort of broad search engine focusing on academic articles. Google Scholar is an excellent resource and will often point you at a PDF download of that article for free. So use that. Good websites, digitized text websites are really useful. If you have, if you're looking for texts, so that includes like archive.org, Project Gutenberg, and Google Books. Be aware though that as you access materials, I guess this is a good point to talk about issues with sources. So as you access materials on these digitized text websites, understand that a lot of it is being made available for free because it is out of date or is out of copyright. So these are sources that could be published, I think it's like the 1920s are the latest, because I think it's 100 years, but don't quote me on that. But it's going to be fairly old information. And especially as personally, as somebody who researches the early medieval Northern European history and culture, you're going to run into some real tricky texts that are, you know, like early 20th century people were not the most aware of their own personal biases. And there's a big reason why, you know, Nazis, frankly, looked at a lot of these early 20th, late 19th century researchers for ways to support their beliefs, because a lot of these people had some pretty strong biases, and it shows in their work. So as you go through any kind of source, you always want to be aware of the biases that the author could be bringing, aware of your own biases. We've all got them. And sort of interrogate the source as you go through it. Like, what do I know about the author, if anything? What do I know about when the author is writing, if anything? What do I know about the institution the author works for, anything like that? And what could that be doing to shade or inform the source that's being, usually this is, at this point, we're talking about secondary and tertiary sources, the sources that are being produced here. So that's especially a problem with these digitized text websites, because we're looking at stuff that was published largely sort of pre-war. So Ciela comments, as an aside, I've done some pretty intensive unconscious bias training at work. We all have them. It's not a bad thing. We just need to make sure that we're understanding the lens. And that's it. This is part of, as a historian, this is one of the things that you learn about, is that this isn't, we just all have these. They're there. You just got to be aware of them and like thinking about it as you work. Text archives is another good example. This includes stuff like the Internet Medieval Sourcebook, the ORB, which unfortunately the ORB is no longer being updated, so you're going to run into a lot of dead links there. But the Internet Medieval Sourcebook is great. You're going to get primary sources in translation. So again, be aware when you work through somebody else's translation that you're getting some of their choices that are being made about this language. So if you can find the original source in the original language, and if that is meaningful to you, it's always a good thing to have on hand. And then for people who like visual arts, image archives are great. I've got a couple here. Bodleian Special Collection. So if you're a manuscript person, the Bodleian Library has a phenomenal medieval manuscript collection. You can totally search it and look at the pictures and zoom in on them. Early manuscripts at Oxford University is another Oxford-based one. Build Index is a German website that's got paintings, all sorts of good stuff there. And then if you've never visited Larsdotter's links pages, Larsdotter is an SCA member, and she just started collecting images of different things and organizing them. So if you want 50 images of lanterns and period, you go to Lanterns, she lists the name of the manuscript that it's from, the date, and provides a picture or the painting, right? So it is an outstanding resource if you want to recreate a bench. She has 50 images of benches that you can sort of go through and say, look, behold, a bench, and then copy it. So really good. Those are just, and these are just some websites. This is a very short list, but go forth on the internet and just be careful as you go forth, watching for, like, does this look legit or no? So speaking of things to use with caution, things that aren't necessarily legit, Wikipedia. I am recommending Wikipedia mostly because it's gotten a lot better over the years, a lot better. And if you go through, a lot of the articles now have this great little block at the end where they're providing you all their sources. I like to just mine those sources, maybe not read maybe read the article if I want just like a quick rundown, maybe skip the article, just read the sources and go see if I can find those. But it's a good starting place for some sort of obscure some of the more obscure areas. You're like, look, somebody else already did the work, and then dig through their stuff. Man, everybody's joining our D&D group has a Discord, and people just keep joining it, and I don't understand why. Pinterest. Pinterest is not my favorite. And the reason is very frequently images on Pinterest get completely like scraped of any metadata, any information about what's in the picture. And so now it's just an image that then somebody else adds a title to. So I have seen all sorts of things, including a image from what I know to be an 11th century early medieval English manuscript that's listed as 16th century English. I'm like, honey, no, that's like 600, 500 years earlier. So let's talk, and then just use with caution. Teni, I don't know Teni. Is it Teni or Tiny Eye? I'm not sure. So Gabrielle notes, I use Teni to find the original pic from Pinterest. So I've done that with Google Images reverse search, but I will check Teni out if that is a better source. So it turns out that I should have read my handout ahead of time, because now we have this whole section on evaluating sources, which is basically what I was talking about earlier with interrogating your sources. So there's a bunch of questions that I provided here, things that you can kind of ask yourself as you're looking through these documents or looking at a painting or whatever, to try and get to a place where you've got kind of, maybe you've got a grasp on where this artist or this author or whatever is coming from. So start with, who is this person? What's their name? Do we know when or where they were born? Often the answer is no, especially as we get earlier. But if you've got that information, awesome. Do they have credentials that we know about? I've put here, is the author artist reputable? With medieval sources, this is pretty tricky because often it's a one-off, but sometimes you can be a little bit more careful about that, especially as we move later and later into the medieval period, as more and more books survive. One of the great, if you've never read it, the Travels of Sir John Mandeville are a hoot to read, because as a modern person, you read it and you're like, this guy clearly never left his basement. He never went any of these places he's talking about. Yep. Probably what happened is he was reading other people's travel logs and wrote his own. But it was a hugely popular medieval book. We have an enormous number of them surviving to us today, which is ridiculous. But it's full of just these wild tales, right? So to a medieval person, was he reputable? Maybe, probably. Like, this is it's a little bit pop lit for the Middle Ages, but it's, you know, maybe they were taking him seriously. As a modern reader, is he reputable? Well, he thinks that there's people with like their face in the middle of their chest and no heads. So probably no. But it's an interesting kind of question to ask. What can we determine about their bias? What's the piece about? How does the subject relate to the author or artist? Who's it being produced for? All this kind of stuff. Who's it being produced for is actually a really good kind of question to ask yourself. So one document you kind of use as an example here would be the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a phenomenal, cool resource, right? It probably was started, I think like 648, 684. It's one of those two. I've gotten the numbers mixed up. That's probably the earliest contemporaneous entries, but it's then following that, these yearly or near yearly entries of just like a couple of sentences on major events, like so-and-so died this year, so-and-so was born this year, this person became king, this person became a bishop. Some years get quite a lot of discussion, some years get like 2 or 3 sentences. There's some poetry mixed in there. It's very, very cool. And largely believed to be kept as a contemporaneous chronicle, which then got copied and survived in multiple manuscripts around England. And each area, as it was copied and then kept in a new monastery, that monastery would sort of add its own flavor. So the question, though, when you look at that is, you know, how real, how true is this? And what you have to keep in mind is at least the original one was probably produced as propaganda for the Kingdom of Wessex. So you're looking at this and you have to remember as you're reading through this, that anytime Wessex is mentioned in a really positive light, is that because the people keeping the manuscript were keeping the chronicle supposed to be playing up Wessex as this great kingdom, or is it really reflective of the reality of the world? Or anytime they talk about Mercia or one of the other kingdoms as terrible and bad, right? Is it true? Or is it just because they wanted Wessex to seem better? So that's kind of the role that this interrogation plays in those primary sources. And then there's a couple of questions there as well for the secondary sources. This becomes a lot easier because especially with modern secondary sources, right? I can look at the metadata about the journal article, and this one, for example, so this is the Norse Concept of Luck. It was published in 2007 in Scandinavian Studies, a journal published by the University of Illinois. So on behalf of the Study for the Advancement of Scandinavian Study. So that's going to answer a number of those questions. It's published by a university. It's a peer-reviewed journal. These are both things that suggest that this is probably a very reputable article. In fact, this is the most cited article on luck in Old Norse society. And then some of this is stuff that you've kind of got to decide for yourself. So like, is the research logical? When you read their conclusions, do their conclusions make sense? Or do they just sort of say, here's my evidence and unrelated to this entirely, here's my conclusion? Right? Like, do they develop a solid statement, or are they just clear blue sky in this one? And then does the research fit with other examples of current research? That's a little trickier, mostly because it means that you have to go and read all the other current research, but it's possible. I believe in you. I like to read research. Reading research is what I do. It's my fun time. So if you can't answer a lot of the questions that in a way that really gets you to trust your source and genders trust in the source, then it's probably not a source to rely on, is my big takeaway there. Sorry, we got a couple of late joiners. So Brain, okay, so we've talked about sources. I guess before we move on to how I approach my research, does anybody have any questions? Have I put you all to sleep? Are you like, you strange people, what are you doing? You're not strange, I'm strange. Nope. Nope, okay, so no questions. Let's move on to at least how I find it beneficial to approach my research. I like to start with a question. So the question that I've posed in the handout is, what was life like for women in the medieval period? Now, this is an incredibly broad question upon which multiple hundreds of books have been written. So is this a question that can be answered reliably? It's such a broad question that an answer can be determined, but it's going to be a very broad answer, right? Some things we just won't ever know, and it's good to acknowledge that from the outset. But life of women seems pretty safe. If you've got the handout in front of you, you'll note there's a footnote, and that footnote is about the first time I wrote this handout when I tried to use the question of what were medieval skis like? Turns out a real complicated question to answer. Medieval skis. They had them. Not a lot of them survive. So learn that lesson. So as I noted, first question was real broad, so we kind of want to narrow that. Even if we exclude the early modern period from the medieval definition, and by that I mean 1550-ish, 1500. Some people push it back as far as 1450, but I'm not going to do that. So even if we exclude the 16th century, late 16th century, right, that's still a lot of time that we're talking about. So, let's narrow the scope and down to what was life like for women in late Anglo-Saxon Mercia. So that's a much narrower range of time. It's a very specific place, which will make answering the question a lot easier. We can really kind of drill down on finding sources appropriate to that time and place. We can find articles, books, that kind of stuff. It will always be easier to answer a more specific question until it turns out that that question can't be answered, which will come up sometimes. And sometimes you're just going to have to accept that, or, you know, write your thesis about it, which is what some people do. So at this point, I speak to the Google. I go to the Google and I say, the Google, tell me your ways. Somebody mentioned earlier Google Scholar. I've got the link for that here. If you don't have the handout in front of you, it's scholar.google.com. That will limit the search to academic sources. So you're not, if you type in visions of the world, like maps of the Middle Ages, right? If you type that into the broader search engine, into just regular Google or Bing or whatever search resource you use, the regular one, if you type in a lot of these questions, you're going to get some good information, and you're going to get some things trying to sell you stuff. You're going to get some weird information, and the value of what you return will diminish rapidly. So I like to start with Google Scholar and just really kind of start by limiting the scope of what is being searched. Turns out you do want to go through your hits and read them. And there's some great tools on Google Scholar to help you kind of expand what you're finding. So a lot of the articles especially you can search for articles that cite back to the one that you found. So that way you can just keep sort of moving out, mining those bibliographies and going wild. Sometimes you will turn up some weird stuff. So what I found when I Googled women and Mercia in quotation marks was I did get some good stuff, political women in Mercia, 8th to 10th centuries, but I also got human papillomaviruses and penile cancers in Rio de Janeiro. So you will occasionally get some weird hits. That one, it turns out, was because Mercia was the surname of one of the authors of the article. So you do want to pay attention to what you're getting, and you can, it's not, you don't need to, if for those of you of the age to know what a Boolean search is, you don't have to go full Boolean, but you can, if you weren't already aware, narrow Google searches by using quotation marks to say, I want to find, the hits must contain this word or phrase, and you can use minus to say the hit must not include this phrase. So at that point, I was like, minus cancer, right? That's going to probably hit everything that this author, Dr. Mercia, had contributed to. So I could probably remove her from my sources. There's also some ways on the left-hand side of the search screen to filter out, like, say you want everything from 2010 and later, or if you want everything to be in English or whatever, you can do some filtering there. So then I want to evaluate my sources. I've collected, I don't know, 3 articles to start with, right? So read my articles. Are they good? Are they providing me useful information? All that kind of good stuff. Thank you, Ciela. If you're looking at the chat, Ciela has just shared a link to the Google support page, kind of with, I'm assuming, with some tools about how to use Google Scholar successfully, and how their search algorithm can be refined. So, you know, is the information that you're finding useful? Is it, you know, what you're, not necessarily is it answering the question in the way you want it to, because you don't want to, much like with science, right? You don't want to go in saying, I want to answer this question in this specific way, right? You want to say, this is my question. Do my sources support my thesis, or do they not? And if it doesn't support my thesis, can I reevaluate my thesis? Have I misunderstood something somewhere? And then you kind of go back and forward, right? So read your sources, you know, viewpoints. I like to break out the highlighter at this point. Me and my highlighters have a very deep personal relationship. And if you go through, I've got 2 binders of research for the web show that I do with some friends, that if you flip through them, will probably give you a bit of a headache, because there's a lot of neon colors. They please me greatly. I like to have different colors for different things. Just if you're ever looking for Christmas presents, highlighters are a good gift. So then you've evaluated your research, you want to firm up your thesis. Did what you find support your sort of initial thought? If it did, cool. How can you refine it from there? If it didn't, also cool. What is a better thesis, right? Like, all right, turns out women in Mercia, my thesis was that women in Mercia had no political power, right? But it turns out that not only was Athelflaed, lady of the Mercians and essentially queen, though she didn't use the term queen, regnant, right? But, you know, there's other examples of women in Mercia with exercising political power, and it can be supported by their signatures on signature, there's a word, charters, signatures on charters. It can be supported in these other ways, looking at primary and secondary sources. So, all right, my thesis needs to be revised. Turns out women in Mercia did have political power to a certain extent. And then you produce something, right? So you could be, at this point, in the handout, I say write, because this was originally kind of envisioned as a how to write a research paper class. But honestly, you don't have to write a research paper. If that's, I like them. If you ever write a research paper and you're like, I really want somebody to read this, send it to me. You have my email address. I will read it. I won't mark it up. I won't give you like, you left dangling participles. Like, no, that's between you and the world, you and the wall. I don't care about that, but I will be very excited to read what you've learned and will gladly write you back with some questions because I want to know all the things secretly. I wish to be the archive. So you can produce something, you know, you want to write a classic 5-paragraph essay, go to town. You want to produce a class. It's another great way to do this. Produce a piece of art. You know, you've looked at the sources. You've said, you know, I think if, you know, to build the most medieval bench possible, this is all the information that I've got. Produce the bench and then write your documentation, which is a great segue into the next section. Though I do give you, if you are unfamiliar with the 5-paragraph essay, you've got a little outline there you can start from. Yes, so Dare says, prepare for the deluge. I am prepared, my body is ready. Send me your research papers. This is literally what I do in the evenings is I read research papers and or journal articles, right? Like, it's a wild time at Casa de Kinehild. Party times. Yes, and tip with highlighters. So just a couple of really quick, one is a rule and one is a pet peeve. I like to have 3 sources to support assertion, or 3 sources, like if I'm going to produce a garment, can I find 3 examples of it in art, right? So I'm not necessarily looking to produce a exact one-off of something, but like for Trossfrau gowns, right? Can I find 3 examples of square necklines? Check. Can I find 3 examples with the square neckline and lightly slashed sleeves? I don't want the big sleeves. I just want like some slashing at the elbow, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be 3 exact examples of the gown that I want to make, but you kind of want to like, is this gown realistic based on what we know of their clothing? Or is this just like, I saw this really cool allegorical piece and I'm going to copy that allegorical gown? Which, you want to copy allegorical gown, go wild, just be aware it may not be something that anybody ever actually wore. I guess that's a little aside. So the other thing is the pet peeve. This is for folks who are, this is mostly aimed at clothing and is mostly aimed at folks who like to strive to be more authentic than not. So if you're not looking at clothing, if you are not looking to be more authentic than not, ignore me. I really hate it when we broad brush things. So one of my big pet peeves is the word Viking, because people will say, this is a Viking outfit. And they will fail to think about the fact that the Viking age runs, I've got on my handout, I've got 600 to 1,000. That's not actually really right. It's more like 792, so like 800 to 792 to 1066 are sort of the classic Viking Age dates. It's the raid on Lindisfarne to the Battle of Hastings, or the Battle of Stamford Bridge, kind of depending on who you talk to. So, you know, that's 200 years. Think about how fashion has changed in the last 200 years. It's changed a lot. As Alfgar notes, it's also an occupation, not a nationality. But you know, in history, we talk about the Viking Age, right? So I'm a little more lenient on the application of the word Viking to refer to things aesthetically. But what does make me nuts is when somebody has mixed and match, like Eastern and Western, 800, 1000, like, and it's period and it's Viking. And you're like, well, sort of like, you know, you could argue, for example, that a shirtwaist and MC Hammer pants are period for the 20th century North America. Did anybody ever wear them together? Probably not. I couldn't find a picture on the internet, and the internet has all the things. So, you know, just like as you are producing stuff, just think about how broad a time range you're looking at. But this is, again, pet peeve. Take it or leave it. So let's talk about writing documentation. Quick caveat, documentation tends to be a fairly kingdom by kingdom, or even within kingdoms like shire, barony, principality by principality kind of thing. Some kingdoms have a very strict rubric that they want you to look at. Other kingdoms, like the West, are sort of like, you wrote a documentation, huzzah! So this is how I write documentation. If you go to the website, if you go to the link to the handout, that's my website. You can find documentation examples there. It's medievalhomecompanion.com. I have not updated it at all during the pandemic, so it's a little old, but I'm real bad at the internet. So this is how I like to approach it. I start with a description of the artifact, a description of the original artifact, and then kind of a few sentences about what I've made. The example in my handout is a caftan from the Met. So I saw this caftan one day as I was flipping through research articles. As one does, I saw a line drawing of it and I was just like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen, and I want it. So I've now made a number of them and they make me very happy. They have bat wings. It's outstanding. So, you know, describe what the original was, what I've made, provide a little background history. So, you know, this caftan is believed to originate from Moshjawa Balka, which is a grave complex in the North Caucasus. I have misidentified it in here as modern day Georgia. It's actually in Russia, but it's just on that border. And then, you know, I've got here, the region was inhabited by both Alans and Khazars, making specific cultural identification difficult, which is true of the site. It's got elements of a bunch of different regional cultures. You could also maybe provide some information. In this case, I could talk about the fact that this was a horse archer culture. So the caftan has specific elements of design important if you're going to be on a horse shooting archery. It also is a very cold climate. So the great thing about this garment is that the sleeves are very close and tight, and then you've got this big open body space. So as you work and ride your horse or whatever, you build up all this body heat around your torso, and then the close tight sleeves prevent it from escaping. And then you wrap up to the neck. And so it just like keeps all this nice warm air right around your body. And I can tell you the one that I have made in replica of the extant one, I have worn it at 15 below with no trouble. Like, it is a toasty warm coat. So you want to give it some context, right? For people who are archaeologists, you want to situate the find within its greater context. The process, what's the process you used to create what you made? And do we know anything about the process they used? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer in this case is as easy as it was hand sewn. The stitch type is unknown. It's not provided in any of the information available, and it's not readily obvious from a look at it online. The pieces were cut out, they weren't woven to shape. Don't know what they cut them with. I don't know that you need to get into that level of specificity, right? Like presumably it was something sharp. But you want to, if you can provide information on how they did it, cool. Provide information on what you did, and then the differences. So if you go to my website, I've got a documentation I wrote for an entry that was from Dere Cucina. Now I've totally blanked on the document, but it's I call it Figgy Piggy. It's a Roman pig, pork and fig recipe. Figgy Piggy. Oh, I'm hilarious. And I basically, like that one, I got super detailed, like they used this type of oven. I used a gas oven. They used, this type of thing. I used my mixer because I don't have people who are slaves to come and do the work for me. So I did it myself with power tools. Process, at this point, like the first person pronouns, second person, like first person, third person, use of one, blah, 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 right? That's a personal preference thing. If you want to be really stuffy, or stuffy is the wrong word, that was a really judgy word. If you want to be really academic, avoiding first person pronouns, if you don't care, use your first person pronouns throughout, whatever makes you happy. And then conclusions. Can you draw any conclusions? Like, what did you learn in making this? Did the garment work as you expected? Did the food taste good? Did this painting come out looking like an original? Does it look right? Have you discovered a secret talent as a master forger? If you did, maybe don't put that in your documentation. I don't know what the art crimes unit would make of that. How did it go? Was it fun? Did you enjoy the process? Or were you like, this is the most tedious thing I've done in my entire life? Are you happy with the results? Would you do it again? The Figgy Piggy, I have made that repeatedly because it is delicious. And then that's kind of it. And then you want to just, the last word I will say is cite your sources. So if you use somebody else's research, if you used articles, whatever, right? Cite your sources, let people know where you found that information. You don't have to use an approved format. I've given you some citation examples from the Chicago style manual. That's just because I like Chicago. I like Turabian better, but this was readily available online. But just EasyBib is great. I use EasyBib all the time. I think it's an outstanding story. You just plug in the information and it spits out a citation, and you can change it. You can do whatever you want. It's fantastic. But just be consistent, right? Like you do not have to use a particular style. You can just say, from this website, accessed on this date. From this book, written by this person, right? Just so somebody else, if they wanted to go and learn more about it, that they could find where you got your information and they could read it as well. And that way you also kind of avoid concerns about plagiarism, or like if somebody comes along later, it's like, I don't believe you. You can be like, sources, right? The credible Hulk always cites their sources. So be the credible Hulk. And that is actually the end of my presentation. And it's been an hour, which, thank you for joining me. Feel free to ask questions. We've got a couple comments, MLA for life. I'm gonna have to disagree with you, Isabel. I'm sorry. MLA not for life.
That's all I know. So that's the only reason.
That's totally fair. I'm actually gonna turn off the recording though. So if people want to turn on their cameras at this point, they can. So thank you, YouTube, for joining me.